This is the Fifth Estate Winning Headlines, your media police post. In this segment, we summarize some of the headlines that you may have missed this morning, but we also take a look at the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country. Today is the 18th of February 2021, and I am 2J.
I am CS.
And I am GK. In case you missed the headlines, here they are. In the Daily Nation, Uhuru rewards Raila Kalonzo. In the Standard, Raila defends hustler talk. And in the Star, separate Raila and BBI. Kibisho urges Mount Kenya. I think we should begin with
the Standard, maybe?
Yeah.
Raila defends hustler talk.
Yeah.
So just a bit of context. This week, a bill was proposed that would impose severe fines, jail time, and a potential removal from office for any leader who propagates class division in the country. And so my first question about this was, why are we wasting time legislating the hustlers versus dynasties narrative away? The law can only fix so much. And so today, the Standard tells us that Honorable Raila Odinga is of the same view, saying, as a country, we fought for and should respect free speech and association. We should be able to allow the Deputy President and his team to continue with their chosen slogan without any inhibitions. But this is not an endorsement of the Tanga narrative like the Standard suggests in its headline. Raila was not defending hustlers. Raila's letter was about opening our eyes to a destructive and troublesome narrative that is dangerous for the country. He goes on to say, those of us who see its dangers should continue educating our people against falling for it. I have faith that Kenyans will see through this divisive and potentially deadly rhetoric and its attack on fellow Kenyans and reject it in the end. So surprisingly, RUTO then went on to respond, agreeing that protection of free speech was necessary. But he disagreed, in quotes, with the very wrong understanding of hustlers. And this is where I have a problem. I don't know what hustlers stand for. And apparently, Raila Odinga doesn't either. If the hustler nation isn't about division, theft, burnt tea, wheelbarrows, and intimidation, Deputy President William Ruto, what do hustlers stand for? In my opinion, Ruto has no interest in answering that question. Why? Because it will reveal that there is nothing substantial behind the hustler narrative. And this is exactly where Ruto wants us to be. He knows that he cannot convince us, so the alternative is to confuse us. And this saying, if you cannot convince them, confuse them, is attributed to President Harry Truman, who was known as an honest and straightforward man. And he used this saying to expose the opposition that used dirty tactics because they did not have any real foundation for their arguments. Does this sound familiar? In Germany, Jews versus Aryans, contamination versus purity. In Rwanda, calling Tutsis cockroaches cultivated hatred. And history is rife with these kinds of examples. I will say though, Kenya is not there yet, but it is a very slippery slope. Plain and simple, the hustler versus dynasty narrative is here to divide this country. And the objective of divisive narratives is to make people angry with each other. Divisive things divide. And, you know, the issue with this is, when are Kenyans going to actually wake up to that? I don't know.
Wow, I like that.
Who was it that said that I may disagree with what you have to say, but I'll defend your right to say it? So even though we vehemently disagree,
say it all you want.
So can we, using our three-part criteria, which is it topical or speculative, repetitive or groundbreaking, thoughtful or just plain lazy, sort of throw out the Standard for being misleading?
Definitely misleading. Right? Raila did not defend the hustler talk.
There you go. Let us move to the Star.
Yeah, in the Star, it's about, it's about separating issues. And I really find myself resonating with what PS Kibisho was trying to communicate. And maybe it's because as a lawyer, a lot of what I do really involves separating issues and categorizing them properly. What PS Kibisho was simply saying here is that just because former Prime Minister Raila is one of the main proponents of BBI, don't let your sentiments towards him and his association with BBI cloud your thinking about the actual issues. And the fact is, a lot of people have taken a stand on whether they are for or against the First Amendment without even knowing what is in the BBI bill. So Kibisho was saying that, look, the First Amendment is not about political personalities. It is about issues such as resource allocation and fair representation. That tension that PS Kibisho was trying to resolve is one that is faced by a lot of policymakers all across the world. The UK government really struggled with it during Brexit. It's known as the paradoxical problem-solving approach. It recognizes that paradoxes are a natural consequence of living in a complex world.
Yes.
And it means that sometimes we have to pause and separate issues. In policy making, the tension arises, for example, where you have populism on one side that appeals to people's short-term desires, such as those politicians who would like people to believe that BBI is about in 2022. Short-term thinking. On the other side, you have long-term issues like thinking about how country governments can build more and better equipped hospitals so that we don't face the same challenge again in future that we faced when the pandemic hit. So what the paradoxical problem-solving approach does is that it seeks to resolve tensions such as those where people may feel or think that being pro-BBI means Raila will have an advantage in 2022. It's not true. When in fact, what we should be focused on is the issues proposed in the First Amendment, in spite of or despite whichever personalities you associate with BBI.
I really like that.
That is so true. You've taught us something new.
Paradoxical problem solving. That's what we all need to engage in. So on that note, do I keep the star or can I toss it?
I think we can park it and see what the Daily Nation has to offer.
Okay, there we go. So in the Daily Nation today, they talked about how Uhuru rewarded Raila and Kalonzo. And the president appointed allies of ODM leader Raila Odinga and the Wiper chief Kalonzo Musyoka to government. And I applaud this strategy. It's a classic political move by Uhuru to increase Raila and Kalonzo's skin in the game. You're co-opting the opposition, if you will. And by putting in their allies, they're becoming more and more vested in the success of Uhuru's administration. I would do it too. So we're beginning to see the real Uhuru Kenyatta, a president that is both random and ruthless. And this shift from a predictable to a random leader is a mark of growth. For if you cannot guess a leader, you cannot mess a leader. And Kenya is on takeoff mode, and the road ahead does not require a soft hand. It demands an iron fist. The road ahead, therefore, cannot be left to chance or luck. It must be designed and executed using a firm hand with allies. So in Nassim Taleb's book, Anti-Fragile, we're told that it is in politics where randomness is needed the most. He tells us that when systems are stuck in a dangerous impasse, only randomness can unlock them and set them free. And this is illustrated well by the hungry donkey problem. It's actually named after a philosopher called Jean de Buridan. And here there is a donkey equally famished and thirsty, and it is caught at an equal distance between food and water. And the miserable donkey caught between these two options miserably looks to the left and to the right, deliberating between the two choices, water or food. All the while, the poor donkey is paralyzed by the choices available. He eventually dies. And the donkey dies of hunger and thirst because the donkey is unable to decide about which direction to go. However, according to Nassim Taleb, the donkey can be saved thanks to a huge nudge one way or another. And Uhuru is taking full charge of the nudging in this situation. And I think we should expect more randomness from the president. Good political strategy is almost always unexpected.
Yes, definitely.
So, on that note, who do we give our winning headline? So it's between the Star and between the Daily Nation, in my opinion.
I would go with the Daily Nation, I think.
Yeah, I think toss the Star because it's making us think that Kibisho was focusing on Mount Kenya when he really wasn't.
Misleading headline.
There you go. There you have it. Daily Nation gives us our winning headline. On to the political pieces that we call cartoons in this country, where we also have a three-part criteria. We ask ourselves, is it humorous or dry? Is it satirical or pessimistic? And is it effective or just plain lazy? Can we begin with the Daily Nation?
In the Daily Nation, we have caricatures of President Uhuru Kenyatta and Deputy President William Ruto. Uhuru Kenyatta is standing on a scale that is measuring his debt levels, and he is extremely obese. And running away is a crying, as always, William Ruto, who looks very skinny.
Right.
And both of them are wearing Jubilee t-shirts, and we have the IMF looking over. And the caption says, "I suspect it's our appetite for loans."
Oh man, Dula, this is so pessimistic.
Since when are the two of them separated from each other? I mean, he is his assistant, right? They did it together. Share the weight.
Oh man, this is
Yeah,
funny.
I guess the context here, of course, is that we got a new IMF loan that came with some conditions.
Yeah.
I think
Which I feel is okay. I mean,
It is okay.
I feel like the West has to readjust themselves. You
Yeah.
cannot squeeze water from a stone. If you want your loans paid back, you have to give some reprieve the other way. We have to meet each other halfway,
Yeah.
make it work.
However, can I just toss it for being negative? This is
Yeah.
not accurate. They did it together. I don't think all the weight lands squarely on the president.
Toss it. Let's move to the Standard, please.
So in the Standard, we have the East African presidents surrounding a patient on a bed. And I think the cartoon is basically highlighting different approaches by the president, Kagame with the vaccine, Uhuru talking about BBI, which really bothers me actually, because there's this false narrative that the president has been focused more on BBI than on
anything
fighting
else.
COVID.
Yeah.
But that's not true. And in fact, this was propagated by the deputy president saying that we should focus on fighting COVID. When if you look at all the policies that were implemented last year, the number of beds that were increased by tens of factors, and the fiscal policy measures, there was a lot that was done both in terms of the economy and health.
Yeah.
So I
Can
don't
we
like
toss
that.
the Standard?
Yeah, let's toss it.
Yeah.
But what do you expect from Gato? Let's move to the Star. Oh, this one gave me a good giggle. Here we have caricatures of Raila and Uhuru flexing their supersized muscles and ripped bodies. Raila is in his orange Speedos. And we have, no, so actually you have Ruto's caricature, I'm sorry. And Ruto is in yellow Speedos. And then you have skinny caricatures of Mukisa Kitui in white and Hassan Joho in white as well. And they're saying, we are strong candidates too.
But wait, who's there in the back with a patriotic?
Oh,
front?
there you have Musalia Mudavadi with his. He doesn't have muscles. He does have
A big belly.
I love it. It made me laugh.
Oh my goodness.
And a joke came to mind, guys. At a certain age, Speedos become Speedons.
And I think this is the speedont period.
Yes.
I don't know what it is about the cartoon that made me shiver a little bit. It was a bit
too graphic.
a bit too graphic for me.
But I think it should give our winning cartoon.
I agree. I think the Star definitely wins.
There you have it, the Star.
I abstain.
The Star gives us our winning cartoon. And now for our final thought, but before we get there, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit like.
And now our final thought. This week, in line with our theme around Black History Month, we bring you The Sword and the Shield, the revolutionary lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., written in 2020 by Peniel E. Joseph. It's quite an interesting name. So in the mid-20th century in America, two men stood at the crux of the civil rights movement and the fight for social justice in the United States. One man had a rough childhood and became a leading voice for working-class Black citizens and argued for racial separatism. And the other was a middle-class boy who grew up to be a legendary preacher and proponent of nonviolence in the fight for integration. And of course, these two men we know are Malcolm X and MLK Jr. And they really just wanted the same thing, equality for Black Americans. But they approached that vision from very different backgrounds and through very different means. And to most people, just generally, Malcolm X and MLK represented contrasting ideas. You have one who is a proponent of self-defense, the other looks at nonviolence, Black power versus civil rights, and ultimately where the title of the book comes from, one for the sword and one for the shield. And the struggle for Black freedom is wrought with a lot of these same kind of contrasts. But the author, who's a professor of history, argues that this dynamic between these two men matured from a rivalry to what he says is a shared revolutionary path in the search of Black dignity, citizenship, and human rights.
Yeah.
And for the most part in this book, he focuses on the relatively brief period during which King and Malcolm actively influenced each other, even if they had no personal contact. So quite shockingly, I don't know if this will apply to everyone or just me, these men actually only met once, face to face. And luckily, a picture was taken on this day. You see the tall, slender Malcolm X with his signature glasses towering over MLK. And this was during a meeting at the US Halls of Senate. And Joseph reminds us of this at the beginning of the book with some interesting details. He tells us that King had gone to the Capitol to observe the debate about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And this was the landmark bill that was meant to bring to an end the Jim Crow segregation. And so Malcolm X, we know, was a fiery nationalist who for years had really dismissed this idea of legislating these measures away. And he mocked MLK as an Uncle Tom or a house Negro. But to everyone's surprise, he was there that day. And the author tells us that it's in instances just like this, where history has turned these men into very extreme caricatures. We've lost sight of how sometimes King was radical, and we've lost sight of sometimes how Malcolm X was also more moderate, especially I think we see when he broke away from the Nation of Islam. And in the author's view, we've really lost sight of how each man shaped the views of each other, of the other, and they had an appreciation for the struggles that the other went through. And so we see King grew so radical and Malcolm really mellowed down a bit, that James Baldwin actually wrote that by the end, by the time each met his death, there was practically no difference between them. And so, of course, as we look at this in the era of Black Lives Matter, of protests and these marches that are happening globally, the legacies of these two men, I think, matter now more than ever. So, very interesting book.
I really liked reading it. I focused a lot more on Malcolm X because I was very intrigued. But you're right in saying that they really did inspire each other. It was after Malcolm's death that you see Martin Luther King taking on a very more powerful, greater, radical sort of rhetoric in his speeches and starting to embrace a lot more of that black dignity that Malcolm X used to embrace so much. So black nationalism was his doctrine. That was his thing. And he defined black nationalism, this is Malcolm X, as the philosophy that African Americans should control the politics and the politicians in their own community. And economically, it meant that they would frequent African American owned and operated businesses whose profit would then feed back into the black community and strengthen it. And he declared this and himself to be a black nationalist freedom fighter. This was something everyday citizens could actually do. As they fought for their civil rights. And I focused on the Malcolm X speech that he gave, called The Ballot or the Bullet. And this was an important year because that year in 1964, there was going to be an election. And Malcolm X was a huge proponent of how powerful the black vote was in putting in people like Kennedy, and how he felt that the Republicans or the Democrats didn't really speak for African Americans, but that if they put their might behind one candidate, then they could really affect some change, which I really liked. The other thing that I thought was interesting was his connection back to Africa. So he once said, as long as we think that we should get Mississippi straightened out before we worry about the Congo, you'll never get the Mississippi straightened out. And so he really felt like African Americans and the civil rights movement in America should really think about what was going on in Africa. And he likened our struggles to the colonial governments and all that, the same as them fighting for their own rights. And Malcolm, in fact, toured African nation states, the Middle East, European cities in an effort to link domestic black politics in America to the larger world of anti-colonial and third world liberation movement. So I really loved that. I love more than anything that he was saying you must unapologetically love yourself as black people. And I think it's a dignity. If you look at how he dressed, he always looked very dapper. And I think there's a dignity with, loving yourself and being, who you want to be. So lots of stories you could go in. One of the most famous quotes was, "by any means necessary." And I think most of us should adopt that. You must live for a cause by any means sort of necessary. Please watch this movie. It came out this year, 2021, called Judas and the Messiah.
Yes.
It's the story of Fred Hampton and William McNeil, but I think it leaves a lot of context into sort of these movements. This one sort of focuses on the Black Panthers and all that. So I really liked this week.
Yeah, which was a very interesting period, in that time.
Very, very inspiring.
JK, I'll pick up on two things you said.
Yeah.
One about loving yourself. I really liked his speech where he charged black people and he told them, who taught you how to hate yourself? It's very powerful.
Exactly.
And what you said about also the struggle in civil rights movement and Africa. MLK said, our struggle is not an isolated struggle. It is not a detached struggle. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And he spoke these words in May of 1959. And when he spoke of an inescapable network of mutuality, the context was the link between the civil rights movement and the liberation struggle across the African continent. In fact, when he spoke those words on the inescapable network of mutuality, he said them in the presence of Tom Mboya. His words were part of the remarks King gave as he introduced Tom Mboya, who was set to give the keynote address at a dinner in his honor when he visited the US in 1959. This symbiosis between Dr. King and T.J. Mboya, which demonstrated their transnationalism, was also reflected in the life of Malcolm X. Malcolm X often spoke with a measure of reverence for the Mau Mau. But beyond this, Malcolm X visited Nairobi in 1964 on one of his many visits to Africa. He met and dialogued with several leaders, including then Vice President Ogiga Odinga. He shared a flight with President Kenyatta and Milton Obote from Tanzania to Nairobi through Mombasa. And he also had a relationship with Tom Mboya as well. Most remarkably, however, Malcolm X was invited to address Kenya's parliament in October. And after he spoke, Kenya's parliament proposed and passed a resolution in support of the human rights struggle in the US.
Oh my gosh.
These particular interactions are well documented in one of my favorites, Manning Marable's Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, can go to chapter 13. But of the relationships that Malcolm had with Kenyans, one that stands out was the camaraderie he developed with the late Pio Gama Pinto. In fact, the American civil rights activist Dick Gregory credits Pio Gama Pinto with contributing significantly to the evolution in Malcolm X's thinking from black nationalism to Pan-Africanism. The tapestry of history can be quite colorful, but it can also be quite dizzyingly poetic sometimes. I say this because I find it dizzying that Malcolm X and Pio Gama Pinto were both assassinated just 3 days apart.
Very strange.
But I'll conclude with this. What most resonated with me as I reflected on the sword and the shield and the legacies of Dr. King and Malcolm X was the observation that a great part of what made these men have such lasting impact was the fact that their ethical and moral philosophies were inextricable with their political persuasions. I'm getting a bit tongue-tied. This informed the foundations upon which they pillared their views and arguments on political and economic freedom and human dignity. Three things which Tom Mboya also spoke about at a rally which he attended with Dr. King in 1959.
And in this context, you and ourselves are all engaged in the same struggle that can aptly be summarized in terms of a struggle for political freedom, for economic opportunity, and for human dignity.
Principles which I find myself reflecting on often as we now engage in advancing the spirit of our constitutionalism in Kenya. That when we talk about an increase in devolved funds to better equip hospitals and expand access to education, this is about human dignity. When we talk about entrenching sustainable inclusion, this is about political freedom. And when we talk about wealth distribution and more money for investments at the local level, this is about economic freedom and opportunity. And I dare say this, that for me, the message and the spirit of the First Amendment is simply this, that every Kenyan deserves to be a first-class citizen. This is what all these heroes were ultimately fighting for.
Oh, I like
is
that.
So true and powerful.
I love that. So on a day where we had a winning headline from the Daily Nation and a winning cartoon from the Star, I'll leave off from where CS is taken off. Malcolm X once said, so early in my life, I had learned that if you want something, you had better make some noise. So make some noise for the things you want and fight for them. Believe in them. Have a lovely evening. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, but also find us on TV. We're on GoTV, Frankly to Air.